Everyone. It's so good to see all of you. Thanks for joining. Hello, Jamie, Jess, Sasha. So good to see you guys. Thanks, everybody. This is a very busy last week of term. I know. So we're really appreciative of all of you taking the time. And frankly, this is no better way, frankly, that I can think to wind up a really insane year like no other than with this special colloquium with you, Harini. But first, let me just briefly mention that it really has been an all-star lineup throughout the course of this entire academic year, which was, put together under extraordinarily challenging circumstances. So I wanted to first thank our wonderful staff publicly one more time, including Allison, of course, for doing all the wrangling to get all these events together, David for helping to publicize them, likewise with Emily, and Gail for making sure that basically everything works around the workshop. Thanks again to all of them for their incredibly hard work in making not only the colloque series, but frankly, everything else possible that we do. So thank you. For another memorable year, to say the least. And also, I did want to publicly thank again Bill and Angie in particular for co-chairing this year's colloque series. They put a lot of work behind the scenes, including with our special Commons series of events last October, but really continuing on to celebrate the founding of the new Commons program, and of course the Ostrom Commons and all the commemorations we did for Lynn last spring. So thanks to you, Bill and Angie as well, for all the hard work you put in co-chairing the series this year. Really, really appreciate it. And as I said, we will have a bit of a special event to wind up the series toward the end of the hour. So unlike usual, where we try to get in as many questions as possible to the last, minute or two, we'll try to wind up with about 10 minutes to spare, if that's okay with you, Harini. So we have about, 50 or so minutes. And like you said, if you're willing and able to stay on for a little bit, if there are more questions or more discussion, even informal banter is very much welcome. We can continue that on past the top of the hour there. So if that sounds okay, then without further ado, I'll properly introduce you, Harini, and your talk here, and then from there we'll go on to your remarks, which are going to be fantastic. I have no doubt. So for those not in the know, I'm sure most of you are already, but Harini Nagendra is an ecologist and a professor of sustainability for more than 25 years. She's been at the cutting edge of research examining conservation in forests and cities of South Asia from the perspective of both landscape ecology and social justice. From her interdisciplinary research and practice, she's received a number of awards, including the 2009 Cozzarelli Prize from the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, the 2013 Eleanor Ostrom Senior Scholar Award, and the 2017 Clarivate Web of Science Award. Her publications include a number of books that I'd heartily recommend, including Nature in the City, Bangalore in the Past, Present, and Future, Cities and Canopies, the Tree Book of Indian Cities, as well as some recent papers for some, pretty low gear journals like Nature and Nature Sustainability, and of course, Science. I'd also recommend Harini's monthly column, The Green Goblin, in the Deccan Herald newspaper. And Harini today will be speaking about just a very small sliver of this work, linking research with practice, some experiments with throwing spaghetti at the wall, which is just a fantastic title. So thank you so much, Harini, for joining us, for sharing your thoughts, your reflections, your groundbreaking research. And per usual, when you conclude, any comments, any questions are very welcome, either using the chat box or the raise hand feature. So thank you so much, Harini, again for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Bill, Mike, Scott, everyone at the workshop. It's for me always a true privilege to be back here, even though virtually, and speaking here and concluding your colloquium series for the year. I think is just lovely. So it's a true pleasure, and thank you so much. Before I just share my slides, I just wanted to tell you that this is sort of a two-part thing. And the first part or the big part of the talk, I'm going to be talking about some sort of experiments we'll be doing with trying to get our research on the urban commons and urban sustainability out into the wider world, right? But the second part is, and really the last slide is what I'd love much more discussion on, is how can we do stuff with the workshop? And it's just ideas that several of us, Bill and Mike and I and Scott and a number of others, have been discussing on what can we do to make certain activities at the hub of the Ostrom workshop the hub of a number of commons activities. So I'll conclude with that, and I would really love comments and feedback and more discussion on that. So without wasting more time, let me just quickly share my screen. Just give me a second, please. Yeah, you can see this, right?
Yes.
Looks perfect.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, I started my research on forests, community institutions, protected areas, remote sensing. But in 2006, I expanded this focus to cities and specifically to my city, Bangalore. And this research is very different for me from the kinds of research that I have done on forests. Really, because it began as a personal story of engagement with two different ventures. One is a polluted lake near my house, and the Kaikondrali Lake. We built a house in the periphery of the city, moved to this part of the city, and the lake looked like this above. And I got involved with the citizen group, which was very small then, beginning to restore the lake in collaboration with the local government. And so this really began with as a very personal story of engagement with restoring lakes, not as an academic, but as somebody who lived near that lake. Right? And a group of us got together, worked on the lake. The lake is now a thriving lake. I don't do any date. The lake is now maintained by an incredible group of people who've put in a lot of work. My involvement was with the early stages of that. And also near the place where I grew up, my parents' home, is a heritage road with beautiful large trees. Bangalore was called the Garden City, has these lovely colonial era, massive, majestic trees. A lot of them are going to be cut for various infrastructure development projects. So it also, at the same time, was an engagement with this civic issue of how do you save trees, with civic protests going on, neighborhood coming together. And a number of protests around that time. This is my daughter when she was a baby with the protest on stuck to her bib. You know, this is very different kinds of engagement, right? And none of this was intended ever to lead to a research project. It didn't start with that. It eventually became something to record trees in Bangalore and how they're changing, to see if that could be useful for research action, to work on lakes, to see if there was, again, some useful information we could give to the municipality. And then as it expanded to take up most of my work, I don't do as much work on forests now as I used to before. But because of this unusual start, I'd have to say that urban commons research for me has been very different. It's very intimate for me. It's very intertwined with the personal. If I ever had any ideas of objective research, those are flown out of the window. This is very much, I wear different hats. I'm a researcher, but I'm also a mother. I'm also a resident. I'm also a neighbor of many people. My family lives here. I have an activist hat, so there are many aspects that are very personal for me. And therefore, this research, at the heart of this research, it was never begun as an idea of doing academic work per se. Of course, there's also academic aspects of it and academic outputs that come, but the motivation has always been very personal. And so the motivation always being personal, everything has been to see what kinds of research should we do that have maximum impact for action, to how do we get impact out. And so what works and what doesn't work has been a lot of really throwing a great deal of spaghetti on a great many walls, both government, communities, activist groups, corporate groups, media. Some of it stuck or made an impact. Much of it fell off and in some sense was wasted, but nothing is wasted though, because you always make contacts. And so what I'd like to do is think back a little and say, does anything that we could use analogously to the Ostrom design principles, anything that we can use to help guide further engagement with the commons? And I say this I just want to emphasize this, not as, oh, we tried all of this great stuff and we did a lot of change, things that really influence change. No, much of it has been, I'd say, blundering through the fog. Some of it works, much of it doesn't work. It's more a retrospective looking back and seeing what can one use and what are the leverage points and what do people tend to think of, and what's useful with regard to talking to different user groups, right? And so working with the government, and I think in any city to begin with, one of the most influential actors is always going to be the government. And in Bangalore, there is it's polycentric, but it's also overlapping, and it's frankly very confusing, the different arms of the government. There's municipality, there's a sewerage supply department, there is a department that does revenue surveys, there's another department that works with town planning, there is someone who looks at pollution, there's a pollution control board. I mean, there's a bewildering array of different, so dealing with the government is not a homogeneous agency. It's completely different kinds of arms of the government. What has worked? What worked very well is work with the BBMP, that's the municipality, on lake restoration, where we were able to show them that lakes are not just civil engineering projects, but they are actually coupled social ecological systems. So when you design restoration projects, you design them in the way that you can account for local livelihoods like fishing and grazing, as well as ecology in a multifunctional way, as well as hydrological systems that are coupled at nested scales. So that has been very successful with one agency, that is the municipality, which takes care of a lot of lakes in the city. But again, because this is such a confusing mess, there are many other lakes that are outside the purview of this municipality, and working with those government agencies has not been easy, right? Why has this worked? If I look back, I think it's because it was a project linked to political economy. That is, lake restoration is a project. It gets funds from the government. And so it's a question of trying to work with a government agency mandated anyway to do restoration to see how you could do better restoration. On the other hand, we've also tried to work with the government departments to stop tree felling. And there are, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of trees that Bangalore has lost in the past 10 plus years. Some of these are 70, 80, 100 years old. The scale of devastation is immense. It's been almost impossible to interface with the government to stop tree felling, to explain to them that trees are commons, that you need to protect them, especially in public spaces. And that's because of two things. One is that you can't go up against the political economy, because road widening, infrastructure, these are big projects. And if you say, why do you need to widen a road? Why can't you just do public transport? That's going up against the political economy, because there's a lot of money to be made in projects. You're also going up against the logic of the developmental state, right? So these are large forces. It's very hard to work with the government on these fronts. What has worked in terms of serendipity is, over time, unanticipated connections to progressive officers who move often across these agencies from one agency to another, which brings me to my first sort of design principle, if anything, the importance of sticking around, of being there for the long haul. People know you, and people reach out to you at one point or the other. The second big group of actors is communities, local communities. On that front, lake restoration has been very successful. Stop tree felling has been very successful, because there are many community groups that have worked to stop tree felling and do tree plantation. But on the scale, this is incredible local work with a lot of commitment, but very few communities are trying to tackle overwhelming problems. And it's really difficult to scale without adequate government support. So a lot of work in a few small pockets. Can this be expanded to the city scale? Unfortunately not. Looking at that, then we started seeing, where are the leverage groups? And often, if you want the government to act, media is a big leverage group. So media, I mean, there's a handful, there might be 20, 30 environmental journalists in Bangalore, and I'm sure I know all of them over the years. And they have been incredibly helpful as very powerful amplifiers of stories. For instance, let's say a lake is going to get taken over because of a real estate developer. You can put influence via pressure on bureaucrats, get the media to cover a story. You can have elected representatives looking at, so there are other news times when I've spoken to newspapers and got a front page cover story that we can actually write on a report. And some of these have got interest from elected representatives that then put pressure on bureaucrats, and even from courts. So courts have looked at some of our work and started the suo motu proceedings, not just from our work, but also from other work, to try and, for instance, stop tree felling on certain roads. This has been very successful. But there have been one-off stories at critical times. You can call somebody and get that help. How do you sustain a longer presence? All desired change is not going to come from quick action. You need something sustained. And just the nature of the media is such that getting environment as a sustained focus is very difficult. However much the journalists themselves might want to do it, the overall structure does not permit them to have that. Right? So what we've done is we do a lot of stories on our own, both in Kannada, the local language, and in English. But the long-term impact of that, lots we've done, I mean, scores of articles. If I look back the long term, there's a short impact. What's the long-term impact? I'd say that spaghetti is, it doesn't stick on the wall for very long. But there are other leverage groups. There's civic actors, especially activists. And what we found over time is we need to think differently about what kinds of research they want. So something that's been very useful is if you have a road widening project and there are government estimates of, let's say, 300 trees will be felled. I think rule of thumb, we know it's more going to be anywhere between 600 and 1,500 trees. So we know they're undercounted. We just do something as simple as going along a road and counting trees and doing an independent environmental assessment of impact. So that's very place-based. It's a time-critical report. It's not going to get us publications. It takes a lot of time. But once you do that, citizen groups or activist groups are able to take that to the government, to courts, and create a lot of change on ground, right? So this is, I think we've decided that we need to do more what we call use-inspired research, and that's really another design principle of ours, and do that in a time-critical manner. But over time, we've also realized that we need to co-design what kinds of inputs people need, because even in a city, there's such heterogeneous activist groups, for instance, groups that work with street vendors, groups that work with high-income, wealthy residential groups. So understanding what kinds of inputs different groups need has been difficult, and how to put all this together to design better use-inspired research has been difficult. And frankly, we've not given this the time it needs. It really needs a lot of sustained time. What about broader communication? So thinking of the media and the communities, one of the things we realize we need to do is preach outside the choir, because clearly the people who are interested are reading our work, but that's a very small section in a large city. There are a lot of people who don't understand what the commons mean to their daily lives. And so, my columns have helped. This monthly column, The Green Goblin, and fortnightly column, which I've recently started, which is Nature in the City, have helped. What I'm trying to get a sense of is what kinds of tones connect to people. Grief and anger connect to one lot of people who are doing work, especially activists looking at broader pictures. But hope and nostalgia connect to going outside the choir. Hopeful stories. It's often difficult to do hopeful stories in the middle of chaos, but you really see that hope connects in a very different way. And yeah, so these are some of the books, So Nature in the City is a book which I did based on my research for a popular audience. But then Cities and Canopies is a book that I wrote with another colleague, which is broadly on trees in Indian cities, following the hope theme, looking at different things, recipes, poetry, games that you play with different parts of trees, painting and art things that you can do. How do you touch a tree? How do you speak to a tree? All of those aspects that go beyond the academics and go into stories of hope. And we've seen that this has a lot of resonance, especially with young people. So this is my last point about, I think what we found very powerful is, can you give people something to do? Because these are dismal disciplines or dismal topics to talk about. And these are some of the things we've been trying, which have been more successful. There's a bilingual booklet, Urban Foraging, the idea of foraging for commons and keeping things wild as opposed to manicured spaces, is very useful, and it's something we've learned from women like the woman pictured here. So we tried to come up with a bilingual booklet on foraging that you can do in the heart of the city, along with recipes from these women. We have stories of nostalgia, which are bilingual again, and we come out with this book. And this is the example of serendipity. It's a story of a wooded grove, which is one of our study sites, which is fast disappearing and has been converted into a park. Right? And it's a little story that Seema Mundoli, my colleague, wrote along with me, and we got our students to make beautiful illustrations. One of the government officials whom we've known for a long time and worked with through along many other initiatives, then got interested in this and has ordered 6,500 printed copies for rural schools across the state, right? Along with a teaching booklet that we've just developed, which can use these commons as field sites. These commons have gone in the city of Bangalore, but they're still existent in rural areas across Karnataka. So if we're getting these teaching activities, then these can become real life field laboratories and get protected. And there's the government work program, which is called NREGA, which is 100 days of guaranteed work provided by the government in rural areas across India. Now, what these government officials are trying to do is see if they can use this booklet and other activities around it to do commons restoration of these sites in this work program. Right? And so this is the importance of sticking around for the long term, because this is real serendipity. I mean, talking about throwing spaghetti on the wall and the various things that we did, this is something we did not anticipate at all in terms of scale, but we hope will be very successful down the line. Seema and I have also been very interested in seeing how we can bring communication to children, because when we wrote Cities and Canopies, it was for adult audiences, but the number of children that we have seen engaging with that book is amazing. And we have been, I mean, one child I will never forget was a 12-year-old who told me about a place, the street that she grew up in Malaysia. And she said, in my lifetime, I have seen this street change with trees disappear. And you don't want to hear a 12-year-old talking about ecological changes in her lifetime. Right? So how can we deal with this in terms of giving people something to do with their kids? So we wrote this book, So Many Leaves, for a wonderful organization called Pratham, which will now translate it into multiple Indian languages, with a lovely artist who helped us move this into little activities that kids can do. And this book has just come out. I'm happy to go into these in more detail, but I see the clock time is running out. So I just want to talk about what are the design principles we learned from this, if any. And I want to emphasize that these are very tentative. Stick around, be there for the long term. I think there's no substitute for that, because that leads to serendipitous connections, because people know that you're there and you build trust. And in this kind of an atmosphere, it's very important to build that trust, and that can only happen with history. Second is do use inspired research, and I've put also in brackets because, of course, one doesn't want to mandate that you only do use inspired research, but make sure that, I mean, I think our doing use inspired research has also led to a lot of other kinds of research we did not anticipate. The third is working with almost everyone, because there are so many groups that don't work with each other, especially on issues like urban commons. There's activist groups, there's government, there's corporate groups. And when I say almost everyone, there's a reason for the almost, because there are always groups that want to use you for greenwashing. So for instance, one thing we do not do is we don't work with real estate developers. Another thing we don't do is we don't take any money for this work. Right? I mean, not even for funding the research, because that's a slippery slope. I mean, when I say money for funding, they can come from grants, or I'm lucky to be in a university that funds this, but I wouldn't take money from a real estate group to do research, for instance, because that's where the almost comes in, and that's the line that one needs to draw. A fourth principle that we've seen is very important is we need to not just preach beyond the choir, but we need to make sure that only the priests are preaching. Right? So how do we showcase diverse voices? How do we make sure, for instance, the lady that I showed you, who may be from a low-income community and has incredible knowledge about the kinds of species that you can do urban foraging. How do you get her onto a platform where she's sharing the knowledge with the city? Or how do you get another woman who has old songs to tell about the lake, which tell you about how the lake was a social ecological system? How do you get her to share her voice with the city, right? So showcasing those diverse voices. And for that, capitalizing on the vernacular. Whenever we've done something in Kannada, it's been far more successful, obviously, and the reach has been far wider than when it's English. The last two, give people something positive to do. I think that's been really important, especially if you can give them something positive to do with their children. That has a big amplifier effect. And finally, throw everything at the wall, because there's always a surprise lurking somewhere. So I'd like to wrap up this section with a deep acknowledgement to Lynn Ostrom, because really, I was not thinking of making the city a focus of my research. It was my weekly Tuesday conversations with Lynn, where she pushed me to say, okay, you're gathering all this data. Why aren't you doing something about it? And then she started talking about her original work with cities. And then we started seeing about how we look at the city as a polycentric system. And that started me off on this journey. So none of this would have been, it may not have started on this road without Lynn. So this is just a thank you to Lynn. And finally, the place where I'd like to end up is the workshop. Can we look at the workshop as a hub or the hub for commons discussions as it used to be indeed? And I can think of 4 areas that we need to look at, and then order this in order of difficulty. Teaching is something the workshop is already doing, developing teaching resources for wider circulation, and it's been incredibly important, I think, to do that. How do we do this with practice and practitioners, and think of this as a two-way street? A lot of practitioners say that they would like to relate their lived field experiences with the commons, to understand how to put that into a more theoretical framework, and then get a wider perspective on it. That's really important. How do we get teaching resources for practitioners? And we need to co-design this with practitioners, because I don't think we can understand on our own how to do this. Secondly, how do we use these teaching resources, or resources maybe that practitioners can develop, to help academics strengthen our understanding of real life issues on the commons? I think this is a two-way street, and we need to do it both ways. The third is something I've heard a number of young scholars, especially from the IISc circuit, tell me that they're pushing commons research in new directions, and they would like to have one-on-one discussions with people, and like to have a hub of cross-learning. How can we provide that mentorship and encourage cross-learning? Not necessarily here through teaching resources, but through other kinds of platforms. And the fourth is, I think, going to be the most challenging, but possibly one of the most fruitful, that commons are now, I mean, so global. There's issues of global environmental change, biodiversity collapse, the climate crisis. Can we engage with these new activist movements, many of which are youth movements, and develop, or maybe co-develop, something that is more useful, which helps commons theory on the polycentric and the large, big issues in really push action forward? So with that, I'll stop, and happy to now take questions.
Well, first, thank you so much, Harini. I'm sure everyone will join me from their homes and offices around the world in thanking you. That was just exceptional. And there's so much ground we could cover, and so many questions that I would love also to ask, but I will defer. We have several folks already joining the queue. Bill, perhaps you could kick us off, and then perhaps we could turn to Krister after that, and then Barb, I believe. So Bill, please.
Thanks so much, Harini, and thank you, Scott. Wonderful, inspiring presentation. And I wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit with us on the role of coordination. It seemed to me as I was listening that you are facing, I won't even give it the name polycentric, I'll just call it fragmented governmental structure on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have what could be a polycentric alliance of activists, community groups, media, journalists, etc. And I guess I'll just put the question this way: if you can't match that governmental structure in terms of its resources, its longevity, and its entrenched institutionalized power, can you out-coordinate them?
I wish we could. I think we can on certain fronts. For instance, the activism networks now, for instance, on tree felling are pretty powerful in some places, and have actually been able to reverse some decisions. Other decisions are just not possible. I think the problem really, I mean, you're asking a very good point. I think if we could, then we could out-coordinate or out-leverage some of these pressure points, right? But that's the second point I alluded to in terms of working with everybody, because many of these groups don't talk to each other. Within the activist groups, some don't talk to each other. Within the community groups and the activist groups, they don't talk to each other. Then there's politics, which I haven't even got into, as in political parties working on the ground. And so there's all sorts of reasons why people don't talk to each other. And I think, again, one of the hardest things we've been doing is trying to be that person who can talk to multiple people who may not talk to each other.
Communication so vital. Thank you, Bill. Any quick follow-up there, or should we move on?
Not for me. Thank you. That was I appreciate the response.
No, thank you.
I
Thank you.
just wanted to add one
Oh,
thing that gave me an early insight into this when I was speaking to her, because I was thinking of this as you're saying, as fragmented, right? And she said, well, why don't you think of it as an advantage? Because if you have 5 different groups that could be taking care of something and nobody's taking care of something, you try all 5 different government agencies, and maybe one of them you'll find the contact who will help you, who's willing to do it. And she's right, in many cases that's what has worked. You try everything, and then one path works when the others don't. So yeah.
That's it. And there's so many people on the call who would be able to weigh in. I think we spend the next half an hour just on that one comment, Harini, but we'll make sure to have plenty of different voices and questions here. So Krister, we'll turn to you next, then Barbara and Sammy.
Thank you, Scott, and thanks, Harini. That was a really great talk. So I have one small suggestion and one question. And so I recently got to know the work of Blake Ratner, who works with Ruth Meinzendick, you know, and Ann Larson, and who's done a lot of work in fisheries principally, but now he's turned his focus on a very similar question to yours. So the suggestion is just to check out what they're doing. And they're in fact, together with Ruth and Ann, they are trying to formulate some of these design principles, quite similar to what you were doing here. I really like that idea, but that might be a good conversation with them, perhaps to do something together. They don't focus on cities and may have different experiences. So one thing that I noticed in their work is they frame that whole question around how to get through to decision makers, to get from knowledge to action, to use research more productively, more action oriented. They frame that whole discussion around partnerships. That the key to them is to form long-term partnerships with those decision makers and activists and have a multi-stakeholder forum, so to speak. Don't like that term necessarily, but that's how they frame it. So that's the suggestion. And then my question is, what do you say to the traditional academics and scientists who say that, well, you know, if you become an activist, you're going to lose your credibility in the scientific community, and you're going to be so you can't be objective, and you know you'll be biased. So, what do you say to the traditionalists? How do you, I guess, straddle being an academic, or how do you deal with that potential tension that might come from being an academic, a serious academic and researcher, at the same time an activist?
There's a lot, I mean, as you can imagine, Indian academia is often very traditionally, right? Even the natural and the social sciences don't speak to each other as much as they should. So this is a question I get a lot. You're not doing real ecology, you're not doing, real research. I think over time, what has been very interesting is, for me, that this motivation sort of went away a long time. At least on my urban work, as I said, the motivation has never been what you publish. But I've actually found that my avenues for publication have increased because there's so much research. I mean, as you know, this entire global environmental change community is now looking for transdisciplinarity, right? So actually, I would say that getting into this area has pushed up the academic engagement with these questions, though that was not the point So I think traditional academia still has this question, but I think it's a limiting question because it really takes you away from the exciting new frontiers of research, which are the transdisciplinary frontiers at this point. Right? So that's at least been my experience. On the bias front, I think there's no other way to do it except to state it upfront that this is the bias that you come with. And I think obviously we know that all aspects of science or academia are going to be biased unless you're doing topology or something like that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Krister. And good note there on transparency. Any quick follow-up, or are you good for now?
I thought that was a great answer. Thank you.
I thought so too. No, thank you. And Barbara, you are next, and then Sammy.
Thank you. It's so great to see everybody, and thank you for this great talk, Harini. I'm very excited to see you as well, and everybody. I have a couple of comments first, and then maybe some questions or push toward discussion. The first is on what I think Krister gave us an example of coordination that in some ways addresses Bill's point that if you are getting some of the groups together in a long-term set of relationships, which I think is what Harini's talking about, that is a big push toward the coordination piece, and it could be possible to out-coordinate some fragmented situations. On the activism piece, I think it's a limiting question in another way. As scholars, when we are offering ways of evaluating a situation, we're already talking about what works. And when we talk about what works, we're talking about works for what. So we're already have a goal in mind and we're pushing for a certain kind of goal. And I think making that explicit is very important because it is implicit in all of what we're doing. So I think that in terms of moving from, the idea is to move from what we know to how would someone implement what we know to solve a problem. And that seems exactly like what scholarship in every field might be wishing to do. In that, and here I'm moving then toward the more general ideas and maybe questions. One of the things that comes up in, I think many of you know that I've made this film about Elinor Ostrom and Vincent Ostrom, and it's come out now, and Harini is a star in that film. And there are smaller films that I have on my Vimeo site that actually deal with the lake that Harini's talking about. And there's another great filmmaker who's a good friend of Harini's who's made a great film about the lake project. So one point would be to think about how we could be a hub for multimedia expressions of what we know. There are also people that have fabulous podcasts. And I've given some thought to starting a podcast series where each of you could be on for 10 minutes or maybe 90 seconds, because in some ways it's being able to put information into something that someone wants to hear over a lunch hour or in some other setting where they really do have a limited amount of time. And in doing that multimedia work, one of the problems that I've run into, besides money and all those kinds of things that everybody runs into for every project she wants to do, is vocabulary. A lot of our vocabulary doesn't fit the situation that practitioners see themselves in. And so I just would like to raise very briefly the question of how can we make our vocabulary accessible without losing the specificity of very important words, all the way down to the commons as a word, which is a not very common word, especially in funding circles for making films about the commons in the United States and in a lot of other places, let alone polycentricity. So two main points: one, vocabulary, and the second, how can there be a hub for some really good multimedia presentations that people can use in a classroom or could have access to for 15 minutes during a lunch hour when they want to learn something. Thank you.
I mean, absolutely. It's great to see you again, Barb. And yeah, you've been around that lake, we walked together, and yes, I think these are great teaching resources, and that's part of the idea with the teaching of the workshop, around the workshop, with a few videos, but we need to do much more, go beyond the videos. Yeah, podcast would be great, multimedia would be great, and maybe even a book and a number of other things.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, Barbara, I would love to follow up with you and Harini on that point about a more of a multimedia hub, because as we're building out the teaching repository, I think there's some fantastic opportunities for outreach using various media and targeting it at a lot of different levels. As Harini, you were discussing with the children's books, all the way up. There's a big push right now here in Indiana for civics education, which is now going to be required for middle schoolers. To what extent can we digest, some of this content and curricula for that age group, all the way up to university level. So that's something, Harini, luckily you'll be able to help us with, and we'll say more about that. And Barbara, I would absolutely love to include you very much as an integral part of that conversation too. And you win, by the way, for best Zoom studio. That looks like quite the command center. Well done. And I think, thank you so much, Barbara. And I think next is Sammy and then Jamie.
I should start by saying thank you to the organizers who are organizing such a wonderful lecture. And I really enjoyed watching Harini's presentation. And because I was living in Bangalore for quite some time. And as it's known, the Bangalore is the city of lakes. And when I was seeing all the pictures of the lakes and the way a highway is extended and the way trees are cut down, the common folk, they actually have no idea of how these things are sort of manufactured. Like I would like to say, the hegemonic common sense, to use the correct phrase, how this is developed, the common sense to make people understand that we need a bigger highway, so we need to cut the trees. And the same story goes with even the lakes and how the lakes have disappeared. It was a city of lakes with having around 100 lakes. And today, I don't know how many lakes are even left. Like we have lost the count also, the amount of lakes that are shrinking and the way we are polluting the lakes. And before I ask my question, I also wanted to just discuss that how I was introduced to Elinor Ostrom's work, because I was in a course with Professor Noam Chomsky and Professor Waterstone, and we were asking what are the possible solutions to your questions which you have taught us to raise against asking institutions. And we had a lot of books to discuss, and we said, where are the solutions? Or what are the possibilities? So one of the professors, Waterstone, mentioned that we must all, as students of politics and economics, look at Elinor Ostrom's work. And when I found the work, and I said, that's something very simple for a common man to understand, how to organize a cooperative. And so I thought for my question is that how did you take this work, which, like, for example, I have the book over here with me, Governing the Commons, and I was reading, and it's quite simple. It's not so difficult for even a common person to understand what she means by the design principles. And I wanted to ask you, how did you adapt the design principles, which are the 8 principles, in part with in the Indian situation or the Bangalore understanding? And the second question is, how do you also, can we use these set of corporate understandings to develop a modern corporate company, or to, let's say, have democracy in a workplace where there's no hierarchy? Because the beauty of this workshop is that she didn't even decide to name it a center. She's kept, with the understanding from Vincent Ostrom, that she's kept the name as workshop because she doesn't want to make it an economic center at the university, but rather just a workshop which doesn't create any hierarchy in understanding it. And can we apply these designs to also developing a modern school or a resource like a car company, for example? So can we use these principles to develop more democracy? That's...
Yeah, thanks, Avi. Lovely questions. On the first, it's difficult to use the design principles to look at a city like Bangalore, because they are really evolved. I mean, they were created to look at long-standing, enduring institutions. So the more appropriate framework here would be the social ecological systems framework, because that's really for all kinds of systems, including those in flux. And so we did use, Lynn and I looked at some lake restoration initiatives in Bangalore, for instance, and I can share that paper later. So looking at those that worked and those that failed, returning to Bob's point that not everything works, for instance, and not everything works for what purpose. So looking at what was the, how do you define something that was successful and not successful, and what worked and what failed in that context. But it really has to be the SES framework and not the design principles, because there's obviously a city with, looking at long enduring institutions and those principles. You're looking at something that is much more in flux, right, where the entire environment is changing. Your second question is a very fascinating one. I would have to say I don't know enough about that area, but there is a lot of interesting literature. I'd have to throw that open to the group here, and I'm sure there will be many who could answer that much better than me. But
and that might be a great opportunity to use the chat box to include some recommended readings and other resources, because indeed it's a very deep and important question where there's been a lot of useful work done. So thank you for that. And I believe Jamie, you are next.
Yes, thank you. And it's good to see everyone here. I wish we were, at a dinner party together where we could all follow up on these interesting side conversations that are happening, because yeah, it's great. But yeah, Harini, thank you so much for your project and for sharing it with us today. And I really appreciated that it has just this element of hope, because it seems like so much of our political activism today sort of misses that aspect. And yet that's such a motivating thing for people. But I was wondering, as you're working to get your research and your ideas into the political and the public sphere, are you working through an intermediary party, like a think tank? So I was just at a conference and where they were talking about that, how do we match politicians who want to know about issues, for their legislation, with the people who are really doing the groundbreaking work on this, which are the academic researchers. And so they're suggesting that at least here the think tanks be that intermediary. What's your experience?
Yep. No, so I'm fortunate in being at a different kind of university, because it's a philanthropically funded university, which is part of a non-profit. So the university itself backs this kind of work to the hilt in that sense. So we have a lot of resources, like a YouTube channel which people watch widely, with resources from a media team, for instance, or a design team who will help us design these books and booklets if we want, or artists who will illustrate. So all of that, which you would not have in a normal university, translators to get it translated. So all of that is very useful. A think tank often comes, at least in the Indian context, with political ideologies, and sometimes those political ideologies match. Often they don't, especially in the Indian context. Again, I would say many of the think tanks, not all, but many of them are very strongly pro-capitalist, pro-opening up to enterprise, and therefore removing or deregulating the commons in that sense. And so some of those would not really work for things which are at the core. And that's why when I say, work with almost everyone, it has to be that almost. There would be other think tanks, though, that could be very useful as partners. And I can think of some. And so on that front, this is a good suggestion. We should really look at how we can develop some of those with the right-minded ones. Yeah, so I'll go explore that.
Indeed. No, Harini, and on that note, maybe we could turn a little bit to one of your remarks there about not only deepening connections, but all the work you've done for outreach, especially bilingual outreach, which is no small feat. And that's one thing that I would love, us to be able to support more through the workshop community. And maybe, based on your experiences, you could give some thoughts about how you've been able to do that effectively through the children's book, through the newsletters, through the podcasts, et cetera, and how you think, the workshop could take some of those lessons on board as we build out these repositories and do, outreach, not only across our existing networks, but, the global South and more broadly.
I'm absolutely. What I have seen is, I think we started just purely to reach the kind of audiences that were not reading English. So we started Kannada for that very specific reason. What we found is it was a very interesting. We ended up making a political statement without meaning to make a political statement, as in elected representatives, government officials. It makes them, because you've been there for the longer term and they've seen us writing in these different places and exploring Kannada very seriously, is that they remember that, and so we've gained a lot of credibility and trust, I think, which was not our intention coming. I mean, it was very nice, but we didn't realize that we were making that kind of a political statement. So again, I think if the Ostrom workshop did that, for instance, Spanish, Portuguese, a few of those languages to begin with a big reach. India is always hard because which language do you begin with, right? And where do you go? But there would be some, for instance, Hindi would have a big reach in India. So I think some of these things would be very useful. Especially on the children's front, I think it takes you into reach of, because English, to some extent, by the time you come to your PhDs, I think at least most people do know English. But if you're getting to younger and younger audiences, it becomes very important to use different languages. And the other thing we found is, which we're doing more and more of now, is bilingual. So any book that we produce is not just, for instance, Kannada or not just English, but it would have them on parallel pages. The added influence is there is that people who, for instance, know English and a little bit of Kannada and want to improve their Kannada will do it this way, and the other way around. So again, you find a bigger reach because there are people who are also trying to practice their language skills, and especially in certain contexts. And so that. But I absolutely agree. I think we should definitely get many of these, at least the videos, for instance, subtitled in multiple languages. And I'm sure that's at least easy to do, right?
Indeed, one would hope. we will start working on that. Thank you so much, Harini. That's fantastic. We're pretty much at right the mark that we set at the beginning, where we would start to turn a little bit and switch gears, knowing that we will have time. Thank you, Harini, for staying on a little bit after the hour, knowing the time difference, of course, so we'll be respectful of that. So first, before we turn to the actual commemoration, I did want to just briefly point out so that everybody's on the same page that Harini, luckily, and we're so grateful, is going to be joining the workshop in several capacities. On the one hand, she'll be joining our executive council, which is fantastic. So she'll be part of our core leadership team, along with the other program directors, and James Farmer, of course, along with our long-term strategy committee to start looking toward the 50th anniversary of the founding of the workshop, which is coming up all too soon in 2023. And of course, the next wow being right around the corner. And Bill, you got out while the getting's good. So well done there. So big shoes to fill, but we'll start looking toward that. And also thinking about how we can not only do this type of, bilingual outreach at lots of different levels more effectively, but also deepen ties with those historic, partners across the global South, but again, more broadly, along with bringing these, different stakeholders together once again, virtually for the time being, but hopefully in person, perhaps even using IU's New Delhi Gateway whenever we're able to do that in 2022, or maybe even, a little bit after that. So first off, thank you, Harini, for taking on all of these different tasks and missions for us. I can think of, frankly, nobody better to put in these really important positions for the workshop. So first, round of applause for Harini. So thank you for taking all that on over this coming year.
It's a pleasure and an honor. So I really look forward to this.
Oh no, we could not be more excited, and this is the result, I should say, of a lot of work for the that a committee put in over the course of the year to look at the kind of strategic direction of the workshop and how to do exactly the type of outreach that Harini is so effective at, that much more effectively, that much better across a lot of different regions and a lot of different levels. So I'm not sure if there's anything you wanted to add along those lines, Harini, before we move on to the other big item that I wanted to announce.
No, just that, I mean, this is going to be very collaborative. So we would really love to get more of you involved. So please do reach out. And I will myself be reaching out anyway to many of you over time. So, and from you, hopefully to other contacts and other people that you think I should talk to. So you'll be hearing from me and many of us.
Certainly. And we're so thankful for that, Harini. It's very exciting. As you saw in the chat box, you're an incredibly wonderful advocate at a lot of different levels, both on the actual advocacy side, on the research side, and just for the workshop community writ large. So thank you. And the other, fun bit of business is we've been trying to make this somewhat of a new tradition to wrap up the last colloquium each year by inaugurating our new senior research fellows. And it should come as perhaps no surprise at this point, but drum roll anyway, that Harini has been selected as one of our new senior research fellows. So I'm sorry that we don't have this physically to hand over to you right now, Harini. You will be getting it. And thank you again to David for presenting this for us. Actually, David's joining us right now, so we can embarrass him in person. But Harini, not only for your long service and dedication to Lynn and to Vincent, of course, and the workshop community, but for all this new work that you're putting in on our behalf. We're so grateful, and we're thrilled to honor you in this capacity as one of the workshop's core senior research fellows. As you see on the call, we're lucky to be joined by several current senior research fellows, including Barbara Allen and Bill, of course, and Mike, it goes without saying, but also Tom Evans, Bernie Fisher, Phil Sabeti, and Adela and Jimmy. So, it's quite the august group that Harini's joining. So congratulations, Harini. We're so thrilled to have you as a senior research fellow for the workshop, and so thankful for everything you've already done and continue to do for this community. So round of applause for Harini.
Thank you. I mean, this is really a privilege. As you said, it's a lovely, wonderful group, and this is home. So I'm very glad to have this. I really love this. Thank you.
Well, we're thrilled, and hopefully we can actually welcome you physically back at some point as well. But at least for the for the benefits of this knowledge commons that we're using, we can do some damage in the meantime. And we're also happy, and I'm sorry to say that Edu, I think, had a conflict come up, so he's not able to join. But we are also inaugurating Edu Brandizio as another very well-deserving senior research fellow for the workshop today. And this is recorded, so we'll embarrass him, and we can do it, retroactively as well. But as many of you know, Edu not only is a distinguished professor of anthropology here at IU and director of the Center for Analysis of Social Ecological Landscapes, world-renowned researcher in this field, but has been a contributor to the workshop for many, many years, including most recently in really taking the lead on organizing the Governing the Commons 30 years later conference that we had this last fall with more than 1,000 participants from all around the world participating. He's also served for several years in a row now on the committee that selects the Ostrom new fellows, the student fellows each year. And if that wasn't enough, has also served on the search committee for the new Governing the Commons program director. And there'll be some announcements coming out for that quite soon as well. So congratulations to Edu, and we will switch to, there we are, Edu. And a round of applause for him too. Two incredibly deserving candidates. So thank you so much, Harini, and of course, thanks to Edu for all that you've done and continue to do for the workshop. I think that's really a fun and exciting way to wind up. And just a little bit of a note there as well, that this is an ongoing tradition. So if you know of others who you think are very well deserving of becoming senior research fellows, these are candidates who have attained the rank of associate or full professors and have made extraordinary contributions over an extended period of time to the Ostrom workshop via scholarship, service, and or teaching. And they in turn are nominated to our WAC, the Workshop Advisory Council, who considers these nominations on an annual basis. So please do get in touch with any other nominations. So there we go. And then without further ado, I think that means, because Edu wasn't able to join, we do have a couple of extra minutes, Harini. So if there was anything else that you wanted to offer in terms of kind of your thoughts on building out any of these tasks that you have so been willing to take on, which we're incredibly thankful for, please feel free. And if not, perhaps we could do one final kind of question for Harini about her either research or upcoming work, or suggestions of along the lines that you teed up already, Barbara, before we have to conclude here. Anything else from you, Harini?
Suggestions would be great. Also specific, I think, links to practitioner organizations that you think I could speak to, because I think we really need to co-create a lot of these ideas for resources. What should we be doing? What would people find most useful? So yeah, that would be great.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. This is very much a team effort, and it's going to take a lot of us, coming to the table to make it as effective as possible. So please do reach out, and we'll put Harini's perhaps email address just to make it that much easier in the chat box. If maybe somebody could do that really quick, and I'm happy to in a moment as well. And then also, as you said, Harini, there's quite a lot of really important tasks, including, deepening ties with IASC on the young scholars front. And we're very thankful. Again, more announcements will be coming, but very thankful for Enza Thiesfeld, the new president of IASC in particular, for helping us do that, so that there's a bit of a teaser there. And then also, like you said, the online teaching modules. I think there's so much potential there. We constantly get asked, frankly, to do more in the online space. And I think it's been a long time coming to really build this out in a useful way to make it accessible to a lot of different groups. So you've been doing this so well for so long, Harini. So we're really thankful and excited to be working with you in that capacity too. Do you have any more children's books coming up? Just curious.
We want to do something with seeds, just the way we did with leaves, but we're waiting for. I mean, this organization works with sponsors, so we're waiting for a sponsor who can who will fund this, because then they do translations in multiple languages. But yeah, that's right. The idea. Yeah,
that's something we should discuss as well. That's great, excellent. Well, it looks like we just have a minute left at this point. So unless there are any other final questions, Sami, was that your hand from earlier, or was that okay? No, I just wanted to make sure. Yeah.
Quick question for Harini.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Quick question that Harini, you are right now in the university situation and in Indian university situation with the fundings as you have. What is going to happen once you get out of the university research finishes? Then what happens in the aftermath of the greatest democratic strike in the history of the world that has just happened in Punjab?
I'm not sure I get your question, because you're talking about the farmers' protest.
Yes, but yes, also, but also connected with how is at the moment your research is funded by the university, as I understand. How do you take this work, or how does a common man take this work forward without the help of a university funding?
It's a very difficult question. I mean, that's why I'm saying I have been very fortunate to have that backing, and since I am a tenured professor at the university, I will always have this backing, so in terms of the research. But that has helped a lot, because you need that sort of stable funding. If I was grant driven, for instance, I would not have been able to do a lot of what I wanted to do, because you just don't have that luxury of focusing on issues that you think that matters, as opposed to satisfying grant agencies or publishing papers because you need promotions and those kind of things. Yeah, so what would a common man do? I'm not sure. I mean, I think it would be much harder. Yeah.
Yes, because we didn't discuss the government aspect on it, because the present government and the strike that happened says a lot for coming years.
Mm-hmm. No, it's certainly a complex issue, and that's one area that hopefully the workshop can help a little bit to give voice, right, and to empower some of these different groups. And we do have an active visiting scholar program, for example, which is both virtual and of course in person when we can do that again. And there's other ways that hopefully we can be supportive as well. And Harini, again, we're so thankful to have your help and continuing to build out those efforts. I'm sure Lynn would also greatly appreciate all that you're doing. So without further ado, I know folks have to sign off. For those who are able to stay on for a couple of minutes, please do. We can continue the conversation with Harini, again, being respectful of the time zone. And thanks again for everybody for joining us throughout a really banner year. One like no other, certainly, but one I think you would all agree, which has featured an amazing number of world-class researchers doing groundbreaking work that's actually making, frankly, a real-world difference in lots of different ways. And that's something that I love to be a small part of, and that I'm so happy the workshop can help support. So thank you all. Best of luck as we wrap up term. The end is approaching, even if it's just a bit of a glimmer, and hope you have a very restful, peaceful, safe summer coming up, and hope to see you soon. Thanks so much again, everybody. And thank you, Harini.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.